October 1944. Camp Algona, Iowa. The office of the Provost Marshal General runs the system from Washington under Marge, Gen. Archer, L. Lerch, and on this ground, L. T. Cole. Arthur, L. Lobdell sets the rhythm. Mess infirmary work details guards. Across the wire stand German prisoner work detachments, many from the Africa Corps taken in Tunisia and Italy, now assigned to farm crews under the 1929 Geneva rules. The infirmary door swings inward. A prisoner steps onto the steel platform, boots square arms loose at his sides. The scales beam skates past the weight he remembers and keeps rising. The medical orderly nudges the poise with a knuckle breath held, then eases it back until the bar floats level. Graphite rasps across a ledger. The prisoner's eyes shift to his belt. The tongue already sits 2 holes farther than it did when he arrived. He draws a short breath and steps down. Steam rolls down the corridor from the kitchen, thick with potatoes, meat, and coffee. Outside, a mess sergeant levels a ladle against the rim of a kettle and drops the portion on a tin tray. Then another, keeping to the day's sheet that promises depot troop equivalents. Trays stack, hands move, no speeches. Back at the doorway, the next man climbs onto the platform. The beam climbs, slows, settles higher than his intake mark. The orderly writes again, quick strokes, a clean underline. A corporal on the stoop calls the count, eyes on the file, moving toward the trucks that will haul them to the fields after breakfast. A truck gate bangs shut. A bread sack lands with a soft thump on a bench. A third prisoner hesitates, then steps on. The beam wavers, hunts, clicks even. He exhales through his nose. The orderly flips a tab, dog-ears the ledger at this barracks group for follow-up. In the distance, dishes knock like coins in a jar. The clock hand on the wall ticks once. The first man touches his belt again, finds slack where there was none, and skips another hole outward. No one remarks on it. The guard at the door adjusts his sling and looks at the clear Iowa sky. The orderly caps his pencil, closes the ledger, and sets it square on the desk. The door eases against the frame. The room holds its breath. No music. No verdict. Only the scales beam, perfectly level, and a line beneath a number that did not exist for these men a season ago. Washington writes the rules and expects them executed without flourish. The office of the Provost Marshal General publishes circulars that translate the 1929 Geneva provisions into kitchen schedules, medical charts, guard posts, and work rosters. In the field, that means a simple chain of custody, the PMG at the top, camp commanders who turn paper into meals and muster, barracks leaders and detail foremen who move men from bunks to fields and back again. At Algona, the signature on daily practice is L.T. Cole, Arthur L. Lobdell. Across the system, other names hold the same line at Fort McCoy, for example, Cole, Horace Rogers, each responsible for mess infirmary labor and discipline on their ground. Between 1943 and 1945, this network grows into hundreds of main camps and satellites, spread through the Midwest, the South, and the West Coast, chosen for rail access, farm proximity, and distance from coasts that might tempt escape. The moment on the scale matters because it punctures a story the prisoners brought with them. Men captured in North Africa and Italy had learned to ration fear as carefully as food. They arrived expecting captivity to be a thinner version of the front, a place where calories were withheld as another weapon. In late 1944, Germany strains under real shortage, harvests cut by conscription, rail corridors broken by bombing coal trains, prioritized over grain municipal ration boards, making arithmetic no one believes. Families stretch bread with ersatz fillers, garrisons live on reduced issues, hospitals triage with less sugar, less fat, less meat. Those facts travel faster than the men themselves, riding rumor and letter, until the rumor turns into an expectation you can feel in the shoulders and cheekbones of a new arrival. On the American side, the attitude is not sentimental, it is procedural. The rule says rations equivalent in quantity and quality to those issued to depot troops. The rule says medical inspection, at intake and at intervals. The rule says payment for labor at set rates, with canteen access under supervision. None of this is framed as kindness. It is framed as compliance that protects reciprocity, reduces violence, and yields useful work. In the hands of a camp commander and a mess sergeant, rules become portions, weights, and hours. Because the United States can move grain, beef, and potatoes on time, because it can assign railcars and trucks to the hinterland, and because the PMG systemizes everything from butcher schedules to infirmary stationery, the rule does not collapse into aspiration. It becomes an inventory line. That is why a pencil entry in Algona matters beyond that room. If the same entry appears in other ledgers in other camps month after month, if belts move outward, if the sick lists shorten, if work details produce on schedule, then the story that came with the prisoners snaps. A broken story has consequences inside the wire. Men who expected hunger adjust to boredom and routine. Discipline improves when bodies are not in deficit. The risk profile inside the camp changes. Guards handle order with fewer emergencies because emergencies are often born from scarcity and fear. Outside the wire, it changes something else. It sustains a political claim that the United States fights within law, even when the enemy does not. There is a wager under every kitchen ladle. Keep the Geneva standard, and the United States keeps leverage over the treatment of its own captured troops, keeps the labor output it needs for farms and timber during a manpower squeeze, and keeps the moral clarity it will need when the destituinever war ends and repatriation begins. Yield to the newspapers that say the prisoners are eating too well, and the system trades a short pulse of public approval for long complications, disputes with protecting powers, retaliatory measures against Americans abroad, a rise in camp, violence that costs more than it saves, and a moral bill due when footage from liberated camps demands that the victors prove the difference. The agency that runs these places reads that ledger as part of its own risk register. By early 1945, the broader war runs on fumes and momentum. Germany is out of fuel, out of transport, slack, and nearly out of time, but it still carries the power of fear in memory. The camps in America are one of the places where that memory is unmade, not by speeches, but by small mechanical acts repeated until they define reality. A mess crew levels portions to a standard, an orderly writes down a number, a guard counts aloud and moves a column where it needs to be. None of these moves the front line a mile, but together they move a line inside the minds of the men behind the wire. The aura of starvation soaked into uniforms from the march, and the freight car evaporates in steam from a kettle and graphite dust on a register. The stakes are therefore simple and hard. If the procedure holds, the myth dies quickly, and with it a source of desperation that breeds escape attempts, assaults, and sabotage. Order then yields output, and output justifies the program that keeps the procedure funded and staffed. If the procedure breaks, if rations are shaved to appease a headline, then the myth survives and grows claws. It turns the camp into a pressure vessel and invites an answering pressure outside the wire. The scale in the infirmary is not a prop. It is a gauge on that vessel. The figure it displays is not a boast. It is a signal that the machine is working as designed. What begins as a line on a page in Algona belongs to a larger pattern. In Kansas, Texas, Colorado, Arizona, Wisconsin, names different practice, the same men step onto platforms and watch a beam settle where they did not expect it to settle. They step down to trays that look the same from camp to camp. They go to fields in trucks that leave the gate at the same hour. The system's strength is not drama. It is repetition, the American habit of turning policy into method. The context is the war's last stretch. The stakes are how a nation proves, even to its enemies, that it can keep its word when no one is watching, but a cook, a clerk, and a scale. They arrive with bodies that read like a checklist: hollow cheeks, grey skin, tone belt, tongues pinned to the last hole, gums, sore breath, sour from an empty gut. Intake is not a ceremony, it is measurement. The medical orderly notes height, listens for the rattle in the chest, checks for lice taps, teeth with the back of a spoon to find pain, and writes a baseline weight that will anchor every number after it. The first night's sleep is heavy and dreamless because for once the air is warm and still and the bunk does not move. Inside the wire, the killing mechanisms that ruled their last months, bullets, cold, and hunger lose primacy to a different machine. The countermeasure is not heroic. It is food, water, rest, and supervision, arranged with the same discipline a battery uses to keep firing tables straight. The kitchen calculates portions per head and builds the day like an assembly line. Fats, where they make sense, starch to fill, protein to repair. Coffee is weak but hot. Bread is too white, too sweet to their taste, and still the trays come back bare. The water is clean and does not make the stomach cramp. The infirmary sets a calendar and becomes a metronome: weigh, mark, repeat. The guards enforce hours that seem petty to men used to nights on the march, but a regular lights out is a drug of its own. A body that stops fighting for warmth and calories reroutes its energy to maintenance. The first sign is not a mirror image. There are few mirrors but the belt. A week in a man has to pick a different hole. 2 weeks the trousers ride right. A month the ladder bones on the spine cease to show in every movement. In the mess line, shoulders no longer tilt forward to hide the hollow above the collarbone. The head clears, and the shivering in the forearms that used to come near dawn goes away. The stomach stops barking like an animal. It hums. The numbers track the sensation. The beam on the scale will not lie for anyone. It floats, or it does not. When it floats higher than the intake mark, the orderly draws a short underline, the tiny flourish of a person who lives inside columns. The line repeats next month and the next. On some cards it repeats faster. On cards where intestinal parasites have a deeper grip, the rise is slow and stubborn, but the slope is still up. The men who came in young and stringy fill out first. The older men take longer and complain more loudly about the syrupy bread. Both groups eat. For a long time, the battlefield trained them to scan rooms for heat and food. In here, the search becomes reflex, without urgency. The radiators clap the kettles, throw steam, the tins hit the counter in a rhythm that synchronizes with the guard's count at the door. A man whose hands used to tremble when he lifted a cup can now carry 2 trays, stacked thumbs on the edge, and not spill a drop. He does not think of it as strength returning. He thinks of it as silence noise leaving the body. The specs that matter are not in any manual, but they would read like this: skin color moves from sallow to plain. Eyes lose the bruised crescents. Gum bleeding subsides as the kitchen remembers citrus and cabbage. Calloused feet stop cracking because socks dry overnight. The morning pulse is slower. The night cough fades. In 6 weeks, a face that had angles has planes. In 3 months, a thigh that rattled a pant leg has weight. Bones no longer bruise through straw. Fort McCoy writes the same story in another hand. Different commander, different state, same chain of practice. The intake weight is low, the sick list is long, and the mess line is a murmur of complaint that sounds like a market street. The kitchen portioner there also levels his ladle against the rim before he lifts it. The ledger there also carries a neat column of figures that drift upward like a slow tide. The same joke appears in 2 languages about the bread being cake for children, and the same plates come back clean. The same belt tongues walk outward, notch by notch. The same work crews return from the fields with faces not blown flat by the wind. The same orderly dog's ears, the same page for follow-up when a number jumps faster than expected. Any one camp could be dismissed as an exception. 2 are harder to ignore. Across a map it becomes a pattern. Outside this routine, the men still carry the war inside them. Fear rises at odd hours, and shame comes dressed as appetite. The body does not ask permission from pride to heal. A man who swore never to take from the enemy eats what sits on the tray because his hands know what to do before his mind catches up. The guards do not speak to this. They check the count and keep the line moving. The orderlies do not praise it. They write the number and put the file away. The kitchen crew does not dwell on it. They wash the kettles and stack them to dry. There are limits. Some arrive ruined by disease. Some resist the routine. Some steal and get punished. Some lose weight before they gain it, because parasites fight back when starved of hosts. There are days when trains are late, and the kitchen shifts menus to match what arrives. The mechanism is not elegant. It is robust. It tolerates a missed delivery, a broken pump, a guard out sick, and still holds the line across a week or a month, because nothing depends on individual inspiration. Everything depends on sequence. In another winter, the same men might have died from what the infantry calls lack the soft word for hunger and cold that makes a statistic out of a life. In this winter, the sequence runs Wake, count, eat, work, count, eat, weigh, sleep. The measured life does not make good stories, but it makes flesh. At the end of a season, the beam on the scale lives in a new place. The belt marks a new hole. The ledger tells the truth without adjectives. This is not an accident. This is repeatable. The tray slides on the scarred counter and stops against his hands with a small metallic kiss. Bread as white as chalk potatoes broken by a ladle, a cut of meat that smells faintly of pepper and steam, coffee that looks like weak tea but radiates heat. The spoon touches the tray and rings a dry little sound that repeats down the line. He moves to the tables, shoulders brushing, wool and denim sits without ceremony, and eats in a practiced rhythm. Starch first to cushion the rest, then meat, then bread, torn by thumb and forefinger into strips that soak and vanish. The coffee is sweet in an American way he still does not understand. He finishes anyway. When he stands, the belt that used to bite now asks for a different hole. He feels for it and pretends he did not. Night is quieter here than any bivouac. The radiators hiss, the bunks creak once, when men turn the guards, trade a phrase at the door, and fall back into the routine that runs them. He falls asleep like a stone, and does not wake until someone taps the bed frame at dawn. The stomach that once sang with hunger now hums along without complaint. In the aisle he lifts his arms into his coat and pauses. The shoulder seam pulls against his skin, not painfully, just enough to notice. He says nothing, and fastens the buttons one by one. The scale waits like a machine at a factory line. Boots square back, straight eyes on the far window, he steps onto the platform. The beam rises, hesitates, and settles at a point he would have called impossible when he came through the wire. The orderly writes the number without looking at his face. The pencil makes 2 short strokes and an underline. He steps down and finds the room too warm. The next man mounts the scale, the next. The process resets as if the first never happened, as if each body is only a sum to be carried. In the mess line he hears fragments of old campaigns, the way men hear the sea through walls, a phrase about Tunisia, a place name from the Apennines, a curse in a dialect that belongs at home. The voices fade when the ladle moves. Complaints about white bread are a ritual that do not alter the way hands bring food to mouths. His tongue keeps score better than his pride. The second portion, when it comes, tastes less like an argument with the past and more like something mild and accepted. On the work truck, he watches fields slide by in thin golden plains and feels the weight of his body settle into the bench in a way that does not hurt his hip bones anymore. A guard in a wool coat stands at the mess hatch and counts, chin barely moving, hand on the sling of a rifle he never touches. The guard's mouth shapes numbers in sets 4s, 8s, 20s, and then stops. His eyes flick to the kitchen door, to the floor, to the clock. He does not check faces. He checks the process. When a tray slips and clatters, he turns half a degree, waits to see if order reasserts itself, and it does. He looks away. The mess sergeant holds the day's sheet on a clipboard with a cracked corner. He has filled in the little boxes left for ration equivalents so many times that his hand finds them without thought. He levels each ladle against the rim and does not scrape the extra back into the kettle. He watches for the small signs the PMG wants: waste buckets, not full trays, returned clean, the line moving with gaps small enough to show pace and large enough to show air. He signs the bottom line at the end of each meal with the same tight scrawl and sends a runner to the infirmary with numbers asked for on Tuesdays and Fridays. He thinks in totals: pounds of potatoes, gallons of coffee loaves cut. He thinks in deficits too: a truck late a tin dented a gasket, tired and likely to fail, that he has already told the motor pool to watch. The medical orderly reads names from a board, checks off a column, and leads a man to the scale without asking about his mother, his unit, his war. He asks about stool and sleep, cough and sores, appetite and aches. He prescribes rest when he can, salts when he must, and citrus when the kitchen can spare it. He keeps a line of little bottles that smell of iodine. He is not unkind, but he has the blunt patience of someone who lives inside procedure. He does not celebrate a good number. He records it. He will worry only when the line fails to rise. The officer of the day walks the perimeter between mess and barracks, eyes on locks and hinges, ears tuned to tone rather than words. He does not parse the German the way a translator would. He listens for the pitch that signals trouble, the brittle edge of despair, the razored whisper of a plot. He hears only tiredness and argument about soccer, played with a ball of rags, about a letter delayed, about bread sweetness. He takes that as a good sign and moves on. When he steps into the kitchen, he counts knives without thinking, watches the way the knife box clicks when shut, and notes a hinge that will need oil by Thursday. Back in the barracks, a man threads a new notch into his belt with a nail and a match heated on a stove lid. He hides the tool when a guard steps through the door, then brings it out again because the guard does not care. The guard has seen this, and worse. The guard's job is not to make him small, it is to keep the line from breaking. The man looks at his hands and remembers them shaking. They are steady now. He does not call that victory. He calls it quiet. At noon the trucks roll out with the same low cough and the same dust. The men climb aboard in order, sit in pairs and watch fence posts slide past. The sky is a hard blue, and the fields are dark, where the frost lifted and left the soil damp. On the way back, a corporal in the truck box counts again and writes the figure on a card against his knee. He clips the card to a little board with 3 others and hops down at the gate. The driver kills the engine. The smell of hot oil lingers. Evening looks like morning with the colours shifted. The line is slower, voices lower, heads bent toward plates. A private from the guard detail reaches for a stack of clean trays and squares it by habit. The mess sergeant closes the kettle lids and secures the bale handles with wire. The orderly empties a bin of paper into a canvas sack and ties it with a practiced twist. The officer of the day signs the page. The mess sergeant has left, nods once, and pockets the pencil. Lights go down 1 row at a time. The room exhales. Somewhere a radio murmurs a weather report in English to ears that no longer strain to understand it. The scale in the infirmary sits still and patient, and the ledger beside it shines at the edges where hands have handled it all day. It begins at a desk where circulars are signed, and ends at a ladle clearing a kettle. The office of the Provost Marshal General takes the 1,929 Geneva provisions and translates them into templates, inspection intervals, ration scales, medical schedules, discipline rules, and surprise audits. The line of authority is simple. The PMG sets the standard. Camp commanders such as L.T. Cole, Arthur L. Lobdell, install it on the ground. Mess infirmary guards and clerks run it like meshed gears. No one is allowed to improvise. The engine is not benevolence. It is a standard operating procedure. The standard holds under total war and shifting headlines because the United States has 3 advantages: surplus agriculture, inland transport with slack, and a habit of turning paperwork into contingency. Wheat, corn, potatoes, and beef ride in reefers to small Midwestern depots, then into camp trucks. If a car is late, the kitchen swaps menus against a pre-printed substitution sheet. Canned meat for fresh dried beans, for protein margarine to backfill fat. Calorie targets are not guesswork by a cook. They are depot troop tables signed off meal by the officer of the day. Vitamin C and greens are scheduled to keep gums from bleeding. When the orderly notes gingivitis in the log, a slip goes to the kitchen for citrus or kraut, and the slip moves because everyone understands that bleeding gums become lost output and disorder if ignored. Cross-checks close the loop. The kitchen counts heads, the infirmary weighs bodies, the guard counts passes, the clerk totals ledgers, the commander compares timestamps across all 3 to catch drift. If the waste bucket fills too fast, the mess sergeant must explain whether portions are oversized, distribution uneven, or a cohort is skipping because the dish is too sweet. Fixes are specified with start times, not wishes. Inspectors do not need to bark. They lift a lid, look into a bin, count knives, and read the signature at the bottom of a page. When a protecting power or a relief committee arrives, there is no overnight theatre. Routine is already clean because everything is measurable. The upper layer of decisions is not theatre for virtue. It is leverage and risk control. Keep Geneva and the United States keeps a claim on reciprocity. For its own captured men keeps violence and disease down inside the wire, and keeps legal labour that covers an agricultural manpower gap. When newspapers complain that prisoners eat too well, the PMG adjusts explanations to the public and may trim costly items at the margin, but the calorie floor does not move. The theorem holds: do not break Geneva in wartime. The bill comes due later at a higher price than any momentary applause. Germany's side of the ledger runs the other way. Every calorie at the front is a bargain with a rail net under attack. Supply lines are cut, and priority has slipped from food to fuel and munitions. The men arriving at American camps carry bodies in deficit. That is why the same standard ration can push their weight curves up by double digits in a season. The biology is blunt, prolonged. Scarcity flips metabolism to survival. Sufficient steady intake lets the body shift back to repair. The American SOP only has to avoid interruption. It does not need heroics. A good system learns. When a state's meat deliveries thin, the protein substitution table activates. When parasite cases rise, the deworming schedule and boil water notices move in step. When a weight line jumps too fast in one squad, the infirmary flags it to screen for edema or water retention. Learning here means turning anomalies into checklist items and turning exceptions into new rules once they repeat. The climb from observation to standardization follows the same vertical path every time clerk records, orderly recommends, mess updates, command assigns, PMG codifies if it generalizes. The value chain from an Iowa cornfield to an aluminum tray can be drawn like a schematic supply receipt: storage prep, portion consumption, waste audit, health metric feedback, adjustment standardization. Each arrow has an owner, a form, and a number. When a link fails, a late truck, rancid butter, a sick cook responsibility passes to the next in line without collapsing the loop. Resilience comes from freezing procedure into paper, so it does not depend on one gifted person. Change the watch and the tray still looks the same, and the scale still reads what it should. People policy sits under all of this. Camps do not run on loud rewards or hollow promises. They run on measured days: wake muster, eat work, muster, eat, weigh, sleep. That cadence strips panic of fuel. It also makes small adjustments. Greens on Wednesday, beans on Monday, inoculations at month's end feel like part of the week rather than events. When the schedule absorbs change, the camp absorbs stress. The same architecture manages outside pressure. A headline can bend optics, but not the tables. Public affairs can carry talking points to county boards. Quartermasters can rebalance issue between districts. Commanders can brief local sheriffs and millers on why trucks get the loads they get. None of that alters the core. The SOP defines the minimums, and minimums do not move for moods. The difference with the enemy's condition is structural, not moral. One system can buffer a missed delivery across a region, absorb it in substitutions, and keep the ledger rising. The other cannot guarantee that a car of grain will reach a city at all. Prisoners arrive with a deficit. The American system is built to erase by repetition, not generosity. This is the doctrine and the factory behind a single pencil line under a number in an infirmary. It is why a belt moves out one notch across a continent of camps. It is why guards count more quietly, and fights break out less often. It is why the inspector's notebook stays thin, and the protecting powers report reads dull. The outcome is not a feeling. It is a calibration that holds when one part fails, because the rest of the machine knows its job. Policy, not kindness, put the weight back on. The myth was clear before the first tray hit the counter-capture meant dwindling away. Men repeated it on transports and in pens, bracing for a slow subtraction of flesh that would end in a cot and a blanket that could not keep out the air. What broke first was not an argument, but a number. Month to month, the beam on the infirmary scale climbed and settled a notch higher than the ledger line from the last visit. Belts migrated outward, new holes burned into leather with a heated nail. Coats that had hung like flags on poles began to tug at the shoulders when arms reached forward. The orderly's handwriting thickened the page with underlines and small triangles that marked follow-up. Nothing here sounded like mercy. It looked like calibration. A rumour does not die all at once. It retreats from the mouth to the eyes and then to the hands. At breakfast, men still joked that the bread was cake for children. The plates kept coming back clean. In the work trucks, men still told one another that the coffee had no strength. They held the tin cups a little longer for the heat that loosened their fingers. At night, the old fear woke in the first hour and found no purchase. The room was warm, the stomach quiet, the bunk steady. After a week, the line in the ledger was a bump. After 3 months, it was a slope. A handful of men crossed 20 pounds, a few crossed 30. Some of the thinnest would in time cross 50 over 2 seasons. No one gave speeches. The data stacked itself. Inside, the wire behavior followed the numbers. Hunger makes sharp, impatient movements. Routine blunts them. Fights in the mess line eased when men stopped triaging each spoonful. Theft shrank to nuisance. The guard's voice softened because volume was no longer needed to keep bodies from clustering around a pot. The kitchen learned to read the waste barrel. When it stayed light, portions were right. The infirmary learned to read gums and checks, and the way a man's hand shook when he reached for a form. The process adjusted without drama, a citrus issue midweek, a deworming cycle folded into morning rounds, a reminder to boil water stamped in German and tacked to a notice board. Every correction lived as a line item, not a story. Outside the wire, the posture tightened rather than relaxed. The PMG kept the standard visible because visibility deterred improvisation. Camp commanders drilled staff on distance and tone. Fraternization rules no names across the counter, no gifts, no favors were reinforced precisely because the machine was working. The better the machine ran, the more dangerous it would be to let personal bargains enter its gears. If a kitchen crewman began to look after one hut, the ledger would show a distortion in the waste and the weights, and that distortion would bloom into grievance. The safest kindness was the same portion for every tray, the same count at every door, the same inspection of knives at every close. Reports rose up the chain with the same plain language, weights up modestly across all cohorts, dental complaints trending down, sick lists shrinking in duration, work output stable with fewer exemptions. Site visits found clean kettles and dull paperwork. The protecting powers notes were almost boring. Boredom became a kind of proof. Systems that rely on inspiration produce dramatic logs. Systems that rely on standards produce paperwork that puts readers to sleep. That was the point. The enemy's own condition gave the lie its final push. Letters from home, when they arrived, spoke of shortages and substitutions of bread mixed with things that were not grain of ration cards and queues. The contrast did not produce triumph inside the wire. It produced a quiet recalculation. Men adjusted from survival to endurance. The question that had governed every hour how to keep from failing lost primacy, to the question of how to pass the time without breaking rules that could stretch a sentence. Soccer with a rag ball mattered. So did books, classes and newspapers under supervision. The body no longer occupied the entire foreground. It moved one rank back. There were outliers and setbacks. Parasites clung. Edema fooled the eye. Winter colds ran through barracks. Trains missed connections. And kitchens shifted to cans and beans. None of it reversed the trend because no single point carried the system. The chain absorbed shocks. The ledger did not need to be heroic. It needed to be honest, and it was. By late winter, the myth had lost its voice. Men stopped saying the thing out loud. They still distrusted the future, but they no longer expected to vanish by degrees. Guards stopped bracing for the sudden lunge at a pot. Commanders stopped fielding daily complaints about portions and heard instead the dull, manageable frictions of a place where order had become habit. The collapse of the story showed up in the smallest places, a belt worn at comfort rather than necessity, a coat tailored by a tailor's hand rather than by starvation, a step down from the scale without the reflex to look away. It ended where it began, at a number in graphite. The orderly closed the ledger at the end of the shift and set it on the desk with the square care of someone who knows a book is a tool. The room emptied. The scale waited. The war outside was not finished, but inside this boundary one of its cruelties had been disarmed by repetition. In this war, the rulebook fed them. In the weeks after, the ledger lines began to climb. Trucks kept their schedules and work details rolled to the fields at first light. The harvest came in on time because bodies that had been running on fumes now had margin. The infirmary's charts arced upward and then flattened into a plateau that looked like health rather than luck. The mess accounted for fewer sick trays and more returns of empty tins. The guard logs recorded less noise at night. The routine held. By spring, the repatriation machine was already humming in the background. Lists were drawn, verified, and rechecked against barracks rolls. Medical holds were marked. Disciplinary cases flagged for delay. Transport tables coordinated with railheads and ports. Toward the end of 1945, and into 946 columns, formed boarded trains under close count, and moved toward the coasts, where ships waited to take them over water, and back into a Europe that would not look like the one they had left. The camp gates did not swing wide in a gesture. They opened on a timetable. Behavior shifted on both sides in ways that were small and decisive. For the Americans, management of prisoners became unmistakably a measurement problem. Calories, hours output, incidence of illness, incidents per thousand. Commanders briefed their staffs with matrices instead of speeches. The kitchen read the waste barrel as a diagnostic. The infirmary read gums and pulses as trends. Guards learned that a quiet barracks was not a gift but a product of cadence, and they protected cadence the way a quartermaster protects stock. For the Germans, fear of starvation evaporated and left a more ordinary impatience boredom with fences, hunger for news, a forward lean toward home. Men bargained for letters for extra turns at the soccer ball for a place near the stove when the frost came back. The edge of desperation dulled, and with it the kind of violence that rides on empty stomachs. The pattern left a mark in paper and memory. Local histories wrote about the camps, with the dry affection towns reserved for institutions that fed a mill and a rail siding. Family memoirs and veterans' accounts recorded the same startling fact in different words. Men who had shrunk in the field put on weight in captivity, sometimes by 20, 30, even 50 pounds over 2 seasons. The detail stayed because it was physical and indisputable. It made the argument that policy executed without drama can reach further than sentiment. It also served as a rebuttal when the post-war air filled with claims and counterclaims about conduct. The dullness of the camp paperwork became an asset. It was proof. There is a counterfactual that belongs in the comment line. If the ration standard had bent to the headline that said, "Prisoners ate too well," if calories had been shaved to make a point, would the United States have spent its credit with protecting powers, invited retaliation against its own captured men, and traded away the steady labor that kept farms and mills moving? Would the graphs in the infirmary have turned jagged, and would that jaggedness have echoed as fights, escapes, and funerals? The system answered by never running the experiment. What came next did not require new fences, only different tools. Bread remained, books arrived. A division with a quiet name, Special Projects, pushed newspapers, lectures, and classes through the mesh to occupy the hours the stomach no longer ruled. The same machine that had learned to count trays learned to count pages. The rule held: keep the process honest, keep the distance formal, and the camp holds its shape until the train whistle calls the last roll and the ledger closes.